on what's been promised. And I do apologise for not being available last week when this session was originally scheduled. So today I'm going to talk to you about giving presentations as a system engineer. And the first thing I thought about, when having to give a presentation on presentations is that the presentation that you give has to be, hopefully reasonably decent presentation. And so that's put a little bit of pressure on, but hopefully, I'm going to give it my best shot, and hopefully this is useful for you guys today. I thought I'd better start with a bit of like who I am, just so you guys have some idea of, where I've been, what I've been up to, and kind of maybe where some of my ideas and kind of bias come from, just so you can kind of put it into context. So I'm Vicky Anderson. I work currently at a company called KISPE, and my job title is Senior Systems Engineer. And I've been at KISPE now for about 4.5 years or so. But in total, I've got, it's ratcheting up, I'm on about 16 years experience post-university across aerospace and space. And I actually started life as an electronics engineer, and sort of partway through my career, I transitioned across into systems. I've done a master's in electronics at undergrad, and then a postgrad diploma in system engineering, which I did part-time whilst working at my previous company about 6 years or so ago. My day-to-day job role is really quite varied. Our company is what we call a project execution and systems engineering house, which means we do a lot of external work with different customers and clients, but we also do our own internal work as well, developing our own systems. And we have this lovely tagline. It's cheesy but true. Our tagline is turning ideas into reality, and it's really one of the best things about my job. People coming to us with a problem and us being able to see it all the way through and provide them with a solution. And with my current job and what I've done previously, I've had to give presentations on technical subjects and non-technical subjects to a whole variety of audiences, and I've sat through probably more presentations than I even dare count. So I've got a bit of experience on being on both the giving and receiving end. I've sort of split today's session into 3 key sections. First, looking at how we can use our skills as system engineers to help us, in undertaking and constructing presentations. Hopefully there's some terms here that, you guys will recognise, particularly around kind of life cycle processes, stakeholders and context. I'm also going to have a little bit of a discussion about how we go about measuring success of our presentation. And I think what you'll probably find is some of the things that I'm going to discuss or present here are things that you may already do without actually actively acknowledging it, and and also give you some things that you may have not have thought about before as well. So a bit of a balance of both, and things you can start doing perhaps more overtly. The second section, I've just thought I'd talk a little bit about presentations generally and what makes them successful. So, how to structure a presentation, how to pace it, and how you might change that depending on who this presentation is for. And you're talking about tailoring there. I've got what I've called slide hygiene. So, how do you strike that balance between your slide being an eye test and actually adding value? And touch upon, how different styles of presentation, the in-person versus virtual, how that might impact how you tackle or approach giving a presentation. And then a topic I've got at the end there about kind of practicing, how much do you practice and how do you practice giving a presentation? And I thought it'd be really nice to sort of end today's session with a bit of a wash up. Everything I'm going to present today is my take on the world. And what I would like to do is, perhaps get some views from those on the call, and also answer any questions that you might have. So please, at the end there will be plenty of opportunity to do that. So I'm hoping we can have some good dialogue as well. So we're going to start with the overarching question: is system engineering just for technical problems? And I don't think I'm giving the game away by saying no, it's not. There are countless things that we do as system engineers that could benefit us when looking to approach problems such as presentations. And it's interesting, when I was thinking about what to put in this presentation and how to tackle it, I realized that when I'm faced with a complicated technical problem, I know tangibly what's in my toolbox, what to pick, what to use, and use those skills, those system engineering skills that I've been taught and that I've learned. But when I get to something that perhaps I don't perceive as a technical problem, I do admit I don't as tangibly go, oh, I've got that and I can use this, and I can, I don't think to pick necessarily from my same kind of bucket that I would if I was solving a technical problem. But then I was just going through this, generating this presentation, thinking about it more. I realized actually I do some of those things. I just don't do it as overtly. So I do use some of my system engineering skills, but it's actually given me a good prompt as well to kind of go back sometimes and revisit what I do know and what I can actually bring, outside the technical domain into some of these more soft skill areas. So it's been interesting for myself as well. Okay, so some of you might be familiar with the Incosi System Engineering Handbook, which is a book published which basically covers all aspects of system engineering. And I will admit I've used aspects of it as inspiration for today's talk. And in that book, there's a really good section that talks about life cycles and the purposes of the different stages. And so when I was reviewing and reflecting on this, it made me realize, actually it's a pretty good way of thinking about how to tackle a presentation. And there's actually lots of activities which sit within the different stages, which are things that I do without actually really thinking about it. And so I thought I'd formalize some of this here to give you some things to think about. I think probably subconsciously a lot of you will break problems down in this way, even without realizing that you're doing it. And perhaps if you don't, or you have something that's complex or challenging that you have to give kind of presentation wise, hopefully this might give you some structure to a kind of think about how to approach and tackle what might otherwise feel like quite a daunting problem. I haven't replicated the handbook in full here. You guys can go away and have a look at that. But what I've intended to do here on this slide is for each of the life cycle processes stages, I've taken an abridged version of the purpose and then kind of tried to put it into context of what that means, in the context of giving a presentation or, generating a presentation. So I think most of the first section of this talk today, which looks more on the system side, is really centered around the concept and development phases. When we get into more of the logistics in the second section of this presentation, that's more kind of centered around that production, utilization and retirement segment. It doesn't mean that there aren't system engineering things that we can put into place, in the latter phases. I've said I'm going to focus more on the concept and development piece, but it's like, when you use a system engineering to solve a technical problem, if you nail that upfront early work, it saves you a lot of aggravation down the line. So that's why I've put the focus on the front end. So it really depends. And I'm going to say this a lot, I apologize. A lot of this is going to be, what do you do here? Well, it depends. And it's the same in kind of how you set up your stall for, looking at what you need to do for a presentation. It depends on where or for what or how you've been asked to give a presentation will really determine how much work there is to do in that upfront kind of concept phase, and also what level of information you're actually starting with. So over the next few slides, we're going to go through some bits around how do we understand our stakeholders, what's within bounds of the presentation, what's out of bounds. And then once you've kind of done that upfront work, you can then look at, okay, what's the definition of what the presentation needs to cover, and then actually start to flesh it out. Once you've got a good understanding of the problem space, then it's just a simple case of producing a presentation, but take into account the constraints and the requirements that have fallen out of that concept and development phase. And as with all good systems engineering, this might be iterative. You might get feedback through peer review and make you go back and make some tweaks, or you might spend hours torturously practicing in front of a mirror and then realize there's some bits that need some rework. So this is iterative. It's not supposed to be a waterfall approach. What I've put here for the utilization is actually the giving of the presentation. This could be a one and done. So, or you might actually have to give up and give it to either maybe lots of instances of the same type of audience, or you might have to give this presentation to different types of audiences. So this actually also might nudge you back into a previous phase, because there might be some niggles to iron out, or you might need to slightly change the context between some of these audiences, between some of the instances of it being used. And finally, at the end, we've got the retirement phase. So you've done a load of really good work putting together your presentation. You've probably got a slide pack. There may be some other notes. Got to think about as well, what happens with this once you finish? You know, is there a formal repository it needs to go in? You know, have you actually managed to achieve the outcome that was set at the start for this presentation? And are there any next steps? So I think it's kind of, it's not necessarily done at the point of just giving the presentation. There's a bit of reflection and kind of tidy up to do at the end as well. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's talk about stakeholders. So what is a stakeholder? So in this case, it's someone with a vested interest in in the presentation. And as we're taught all through system engineering, it's really, really important to understand who your stakeholders are, what they want and what they need. Because ultimately we want to provide something that provides utility or value. That's our whole goal. And one of the techniques I like to use to look at stakeholders is something called a pig in the middle diagram. And it helps you explore who's interested in a certain thing and why. So what you do is you put your item of interest in the middle, and then you add your stakeholders around the outside. And on those links between your item of interest and your stakeholders, you put what their interest is on that link. So let's take this ECF presentation as an example. There's at least one obvious stakeholder in any presentation that you give, and that is the audience. They're in effect the user of the presentation, but they may or may not be the customer. So we add the customer as another stakeholder here. So let's talk about the audience first. Sometimes your audience is going to be homogeneous, right? They're all going to have the same interests. But more often than not, you end up presenting to people who all have slightly different interests. And it's really worth spending some time to think about these different interests, as it will help when you come to considering sort of tailoring and setting the context and boundary for the presentation. It may be actually having one singular role of audience or one stakeholder of audience is insufficient, and you might actually want to start splitting them out into more detail. So if I use today's presentation example, the audience I think are all INCOSE ECF members, but you're all going to have slightly different mental models on what makes a good presentation based upon, you know, your prior experience. But I'm hoping by virtue of being here, you all have similar interests. You're all at least vaguely interested in hearing about presentation skills, hopefully, you know, going to learn something to take away with you to use going forward. But some of you may have given lots of presentations before, and you might be more interested in asking for specific feedback on a topic, or others of you may have had more experience on being in like receive mode, you know, being presented to, but you haven't actually had to sit and construct many presentations. So you might be more interested in that side. So what I tried to do here, and I do apologise, it's a slightly contrived example, but I wanted to use one hopefully everyone could relate to, is I've sort of distilled this down into a set of interests that the audience might want for this particular presentation. So I've got here about wanting tangible information to use, having something that's actionable rather than just waffle. So fingers crossed I succeeded that one at the end. Information in a format that can be taken away later and reviewed and used, because you may not, you know, unless you're writing a presentation right now, some of this, you know, you may not use for, you know, a set period of time. Some of you will want the opportunity to ask questions. Most of you, would like it to be interesting and not boring, you know, useful way to spend your lunch break. And also, you know, as a way to contribute to your continued professional development. I imagine that's what a lot of you are interested in and is being part of the ECF. If, you know, we were thinking this was a more technical presentation, you know, there might actually be a specific question that needs to be answered. So if it was a briefing on performance of a particular item, it might be there's some statistical evidence that's of interest, or you might be trying to convince someone that your ideas are right is the right one even. And so, you know, you might need to present the pros and cons of certain solutions. It could be a progress update. And so your audience might be interested in how well a project's doing. You might have a mixed audience, as I said earlier. So, you know, you might be giving an update, but have both technical and project staff in one audience. And so the technical portion may be more interested in the solution that you're trying to employ, whereas project typically are more interested in how much it's costing them and whether it's on time and on budget. You know, so you've got different things to consider. So you say you might want to split your audience out and think about some of their interests, and hopefully there is some overlap. if I was at this point and I'd put my audience on and I'd, draw my line, I was thinking, right, what are they interested in? And I couldn't put anything on that line other than, not being bored. But if I couldn't think of a thing they were actually trying to get out of this presentation, I would need to go away and elicit that information. It would mean I didn't know what the intent of this presentation was. So I know I haven't come around and surveyed everybody for this and said, oh, hey, what do you want to get out of this? But I've used like my experience and kind of my mental model of what I think would be beneficial to derive this set of needs. If I was asked to give a presentation on something I was much less familiar on, I might need to go back to the customer or my peers and ask them for some thoughts and input so I can really make sure I capture what I think the needs are of the various stakeholders. Okay, so at the start, we added the customer as a stakeholder, and this might be the entity that's requested the presentation. So in this case, it was the ECF committee, or it might be the ultimate recipient of whatever system's being developed that you happen to be talking about as part of your presentation. And so they're going to have some interest and need as well that they would like to see satisfied by the presentation, but it may be different to that of the audience. So I apologise in advance to the ECF committee. I've elicited what I think your interests are in this presentation. So I've put these up here. So I think they want to have a presentation that adds value to their offering to their ECF members and provides a route for continued professional development for their members, and also because the success of these sessions are dependent upon the quality of the offerings that they get. So they're going to want this to be a high quality offering as well, so that it's good as a promotional tool and brings other people into the ECF and gets them involved. So that's kind of what I've put there. So you can see their interests are slightly different to those of the audience, but there is some overlap. And I think it's really important at this point to remember that these are stakeholder roles that are shown on this figure. So, just because you're a member of a customer role doesn't mean that an individual couldn't also be a part of the audience role as well. It just might mean they have a wider set of interests than others that need to be serviced. If I go back now to sort of a technical example, it might be that actually your customer who's asked for the presentation isn't actually the entity that has to use the information that's presented. So if I think about my day-to-day job role, sometimes I act as what is called a customer friend. So so the customer is effectively paying for a supplier to present information on a particular topic, but the customer can't act as a technical reviewer because they don't have the requisite knowledge. So actually we come in and we act as the reviewer, and so therefore we become the audience for the presentation, and then we have to, as an outcome, provide that feedback to the customer on the outcome of the presentation. So it's important to understand kind of who is using the information and why they're interested, and this will help you when it comes to looking at things like tailoring, which we'll talk about shortly. Another really important stakeholder that's involved in the presentation is you, the presenter, because without you, there would be no presentation. And so we don't want to forget this. And I think it's important to sort of also think about other things that you're looking to get out of from giving the presentation. So if I use this presentation as an example, I know I'm interested in getting some experience in presenting on a topic that I haven't had to do before, and also contributing towards my own professional development. My professional development and that of the audience member might look slightly different because we're coming at it from different angles, but we both have interests in these areas. If I was giving this presentation on a technical matter, I might be looking to get some kind of decision or outcome from this, and that might be my real interest. And I've got one final stakeholder that came up with. This is not an exhaustive list. There are probably many others, but this is what I could think of in conjunction with this particular context. And I did come up with one final stakeholder, but I couldn't actually, I must admit, I couldn't come up with some interest that they might have on this particular presentation. So I'm going to have to, afraid, go to a non-ECF related example for this. But say you're giving a presentation for your company, there might be certain things that it has to be satisfied. So one of these things could be about having to be mindful about what commercial or sensitive data is being presented. There are, as some of you may be aware, kind of different classes of classification of information and data. Or it might also be that, information has to be presented in a certain format. There might be things, if you're maybe doing a safety case, presentation, there might be a certain format that these things have to be presented in. So you can't kind of, you're constrained in some ways about how you do your presentation of your information. But really, the intent of this exercise is to become familiar with who you're presenting to and what the intent of the presentation needs to be. And if you can't answer this question, then you need to go away and do more work, maybe speak to others and be able to kind of distill down who you're doing this presentation for and why do they care. That's the crux of this. Now, we'll look now about where, and hopefully some of you recognise the figure on the right there. We're going to look at now at the environment, context and boundaries. And you can't do this in isolation from exploring the stakeholder needs. It might be that when you start thinking about kind of these concepts that you actually need to go back and add more stakeholders in, because it might add some additional needs and wants. So these I see going hand in hand and running, almost alongside in parallel. And I kind of see this phase of really looking at, okay, you know who you think you're going to present to and why they're interested. And so now you're looking at, okay, what does the presentation need to cover and what's in or out of scope? And I see this exactly the same as when you're exploring and setting the context of a technical problem. So we look at what's within our system of interest, what's of our direct concern, and what we have control over and influence over. And then we have outside of that, the wider system of interest, which might influence what we put inside our system of interest, and they might have a relationship, but we might not have some, direct control or influence over those aspects. And then as you traverse out, the amounts of influence and control you have when you go through the environment and wider environment reduce, but they can have an impact on yourself. So I think as I already sort of touched on, ultimately a presentation is all about answering a question or servicing a problem. And being aware of kind of the environment within which your presentation sits really helps you sort of with the trick of drawing a successful boundary around your presentation and what you're going to be talking about. Now, if I use the example of this ECF presentation again, I know there's been other presentations in this series that some of you may have attended, and they sit, I would say, within the wider system of interest. I have limited influence over them. Some of them already happened, some of them to happen, but that's not set by me. But I know that mine sits within this set. So that's why, for example, I haven't in this presentation gone into great detail about what system engineering is and those sorts of things, because I'm assuming it's been covered elsewhere. And where stakeholders sit in this kind of how much influence you have over them might depend on kind of the type of stakeholders you have. So for a lot of us, those regulatory stakeholders sit out where we can't influence them, but they have great influence on us. But some of our audience members and things, depending on whether they're internal or depending on the relationship, you may actually they may be closer to you in influence than in other cases. But one of the things we've got to be really careful, so we establish all our stakeholders, it's really important to think about the relative importance of your different stakeholder needs. It wouldn't be appropriate to put my needs and interests at the same level of importance as those of what the audience are interested in for this particular presentation, right? That would skew the whole presentation and wouldn't satisfy kind of the ultimate need. So I think what's neat to think about, and we do this a lot in system engineering, is think about what's the key problem statement that you're trying to solve. I haven't gone into them here, but there are lots of system engineering techniques to be able to develop a single problem statement. And what you really want to do is be able to distill that down as something that's not more than a headful, because you'll find, I mean, this is quite a long presentation. If I had to remember lots of things as I was going through this, I would really struggle to keep that coherent story. So you want to be able to have something succinct enough that you can keep it in mind whilst developing your presentation and think, does this sit within what I need to be able to answer that question? If I was giving a review, reporting technical and programmatic status, I've also got to be mindful not to bias perhaps the presentation inadvertently. So I'm technical by background, and that is where I'm way more comfortable. So I'm more likely to go on and on about the technical solution, how neat it is, and then normally just do a little footnote to schedule and budget later, unless by some miracle I was coming in cheaper and quicker, then I probably would headline with that just to keep the project people happy. But it's really you've got to kind of look at it outside of your own constraints and go, what is it that the others need, and not stick with the things that are just comfortable to you or of interest to yourself. So if we can distill our problem, what our presentation needs to be, down to a problem statement, we can then look at doing kind of breaking this down into kind of a set of manageable chunks in order to what needs to be covered to answer the question. And again, I'm back to my it depends. It's a bit like when you break down a technical problem, the level of which you kind of break this down to is a little bit subjective. And some of it does, unfortunately, come with experience, your engineering judgment and things, which comes with experience and practice. But one of the things I always sort of say when people say, well, what do system engineers do? I always say, like, a lot of system engineers' role is taking people on a journey, so they understand what is happening. So in this case, you think about your presentation as being taking someone on a journey to answer the problem statement, and hopefully kind of thinking about it in this way will help provide like a bit of a framework in how to generate your kind of presentation product. And by breaking sort of things down and looking at, okay, what things are needed to answer this question, will hopefully also expose where areas where there's gaps in your knowledge, and where you need to go away and find out some more information. So if you guys came to me and said, oh, hey, Vicky, can you give a general presentation on how satellites work? I think, given my experience, touch wood, I would be able to, give that presentation with not too much worries. If you would come and say, Vicky, can you give me a presentation on orbital mechanics? Then I would have to go away and seriously think about it, as it's not an area specialism. And I would also have to think about who is the audience, because if I was going to have to give a presentation on orbital mechanics to a bunch of astrophysicists, I'm really probably not your person, because my level of knowledge would not be sufficient to give them what they needed, not without a lot of coaching and help from others. So it might be in some of those instances you actually go, well, I'm not going to be able to deliver what's required. I actually need to give this off to someone else, or I need to go and do an awful lot of work to become the expert that's required to give the presentation. So we've worked out who we're talking to and why we're talking to them. And so how do we know if we've actually done a good job? I'm not advocating writing a full requirement set for your presentation with a bunch of verification methods and the like, but there are certain things you can consider. So there are a number of constraints. These are just a short list here, but making a note of these at the start is always a good place to begin. And also these are quite like more tangible. You can kind of say, did I meet these? These are kind of generally a yes no sort of question. So some constraints you might need to think about is how long you have to present, because that will set perhaps the depth you can go to in some of the areas. Sometimes you get like limits of numbers of slides. So if you're doing kind of like elevator pitch style sessions, you might be told you've got 2 minutes, but maybe 3 slides. So you might have to think about how you present that information and what the appropriate split should be. And also, there's this Red Dwarf quote where I think it's Rimmer goes away and he spends all his time making his revision plan and never actually does the revising. And he fails his test. It's the same with a presentation, right? You're going to have a set amount of preparation time. What you don't want to do is use all of that time planning and then have no time left at the end to generate the presentation, because it can take a surprising amount of time to put together slides which are coherent, tell the story, and so on and so forth. And again, how long you spend, the split of time, you'll learn as you go through, but that's really also another key thing to think about. So we talked about some nice easy things to be able to tick off. it may be more difficult to validate whether your presentation did what it needed to. This is much easier if you're maybe looking for like a black or white answer, you know, like, shall we buy X or Y? And if at the end of the decision someone says, well, buy X, right? You know that your presentation succeeded, there's a decision being made, and everyone can move on. But like in the case of this presentation, right, I'm looking to share some information with you on how to tackle presentations. And some of you will come out of this afterwards and just go, oh, you'll know whether this was useful or not. For some of you, it might not be till you sit down and actually go to write your next presentation. You'll be like, oh, there's that thing that Vicky said. Actually, that's useful. I'll implement that. So you kind of you get some, hopefully, you know, use going forward, and you'll know whether it was useful or not. But for me, it's trickier. You know, how do I know whether I've imparted value? I mean, the straightforward metric is, you know, did everyone log out of the call after 10 minutes and, you know, disappear? You know, are people asleep? You know, and so on and so forth. But knowing whether you've imparted value is tricky. And so if I wanted to know how successful this was, I would need to speak to people like the ECF committee to gather some thoughts. Or of course, you know, people are welcome to drop me a line as well. That would be fine. But I would need to actively perhaps source that verification, that validation and feedback. So something to think about is if you're giving a presentation, you want feedback. Now you probably need to ask for it, but it may not always be appropriate to ask. So if I was giving a presentation and I was doing a safety case and it was external to an external regulator, I don't really want to get to the end and be like, okay, cool, was that all right? And do you have anything, you know, I could do better? And because that's not the external regulator is not the person, you know, you should be asking for that feedback from. You probably want to go to a colleague and brief the colleague beforehand and say, you know, can you give me some offline feedback as to whether that was, you know, okay, what I can learn, what do I do differently next time, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I've spent quite a lot of time, I apologise, kind of waffling on about ways to think about presentations, and I just wanted to touch on now some of the logistical aspects, just to give you some thoughts about how I would tackle presentation generation. So we've all probably been in presentations where it felt like time is stopped, or we're a pinball and we're literally flying from one topic to another. You know, as the presenter, you can have the best answer to a problem. You know, you could have, you know, life-changing, world-solving answer, but if you can't articulate it well, then you undermine your entire argument. And you'll notice in the presentation, probably not till the end, so apologies in advance for that. But I employ the old trick of tell them what you're going to tell them it, and then tell them what you told them. This is quite a long presentation, and on the face of it, quite a woolly sort of topic. And so taking this approach kind of helps bring everyone in line for like the method of how I'm tackling the problem and how the story is going to unfold. This means you have some notional idea of what's going to be covered, and the way that I've kind of constructed this path aligns with how I broke down the problem in that concept and development phase. So hopefully that means this has a logical flow and you can see what it's building to. Now, if I'd only been given 5 minutes, then taking this approach might be too long-winded and actually cut down on the time that I have to get the message across to you guys. But I always think it's worth, even if you only, you know, have a sentence or two, to kind of give an introduction of the intent of what's going to be presented. This sort of helps align the mental models across your audience and also gives them like a way in. I have to admit, I talk quickly, naturally. And if I've had a decent amount of caffeine and I'm passionate about the subject, you know, maybe I've got some nerves as well, I can like rattle through a topic in no time at all. And in this case, it really wouldn't matter how well I'd structured it, how good my argument was, if I don't let my audience keep up. So if I'm at the end, before you've even had time to process the first thing I've said, you know, this whole thing falls apart. Now, I'm not advocating, you know, you just stop and sit around for the while in the middle of your presentation, but it is good to be considerate about the amount of information that you're presenting at a time. So it might be that you want to take questions at the end of specific topics or stages if there's going to be a lot of information. And it saves people having to try and remember everything to the end. Because what you might find, if someone's sort of stuck on a topic you've been talking about earlier, they might be chewing that over and not following along as closely with the rest of the presentation. So if, like me, you're a fast talker or maybe just prone to nerves, take a deep breath between sentences, bullets, and topic changes. It might feel slow to you. It always feels painfully slow to me when I consciously remember to do it, but it gives everyone that chance to catch up and move with you onto the next stage. Okay, so tailoring is a tricky topic, and again, it's one of my it depends. Sometimes it's really straightforward, and other times you need to actually put like a really good amount of thought into it and iteration. The more disparate your audience interests are, the harder it can be to satisfy everyone's needs. And this comes back to when we talked about stakeholders at the beginning, really thinking about who is the most important and what's the problem that you're trying to solve. And if you have material in your presentation that doesn't contribute towards that, why is it there? Really think about why have you put that material in there? So I think the trickiest example, and if we haven't come across this yet, you will do in your technical career, is where you have a technical problem and you're presenting to someone who is much less technical than you. So, it might be that you want some funding for a stream of work and you need buy-in from management who aren't involved in your day-to-day kind of technical area. So you need to find a way to tell them about the technical aspects without disappearing down for them what is for them an incomprehensible rabbit hole, and leaving them feeling empowered at the end to be able to make a decision. And unfortunately, there isn't a paint by numbers approach to this problem, at least not one I've come across. If anyone does have one, do feel free to throw it my way. You don't get infinite time in presentations. So, and also you'll irritate some people if you always go back to first principles. That's unlikely to be a successful approach, and some people really they'll put their backs out there, like think, well, have you gone back so far? So the key is to really think about what information does the stakeholder need to be able to make their decision. Are there comparable examples that you can make to put it into context that they would understand? Do you need to break it into a couple of sessions? Do you need to give them some of the upfront technical information, give them, a break to have some time to think about it, and then have another session where you make that decision? Is there background material you can provide? Bearing in mind the danger of that though is, and I'm as guilty as anyone else, remembering to read said information before the presentation can be tricky. So that may not quite give you what you want. Talked about biasing a little bit already, but there's a danger, especially when you're looking for decisions to be made, to kind of skew what's been presented, for what you prefer. And so it's always worth doing a review of the material that you're presenting and kind of trying very hard to step outside of your own kind of bias, your mental model, and going, does this look balanced? And if you have, I think if you have a clear idea of your stakeholders, the context and the problem statement, this should really kind of help with that. And if possible, always have someone else have a look at your slides. If I was doing a complicated presentation, I would probably loop someone in way before I even started, writing all the detail on the slides to make sure, have I got the right problem statement? Is that intent that I'm setting correct? And then maybe later have them look at actually the material that I've produced. Slide hygiene is always an interesting one. How much is too much or too little? And again, it really depends. It all comes back to what the intention of the presentation is. So if I'm giving a technical presentation on the performance of a system and its safety criteria, and where the presentation is actually a deliverable into a formal review, you'll find my slides are way wordier than what's on here today. And that's because, the actual slide deck needs to be a formal deliverable and stand on its own two legs without me stood there kind of talking by the side of it. Whereas presentations like these, which are a bit less formal, and there's going to be a recording and I'll share the slides with the ECF so they can pass them on, I don't need to cram everything I'm going to say into a slide. It's just not required. And one of the needs, as you may remember, is I wanted this presentation, or the audience would want this presentation to be interesting. Now, my own personal preference, and this may not be the same for everyone else, is I find things more engaging and interesting when, it's not everything's not already up on the slide and the presenter's not just, reading off the slides. They actually add value by talking around what's on the slides. So but they say that's personal preference. It may be different for some of you. Making sure slides are legible, that's a really key one. So the thinking about colors, font sizes, font styles. If you need to go onto another slide, then do so. Just try and keep like things grouped together, so you don't end mid-sentence and then start that, finish that sentence on another slide. Try and just make it easy to follow. If you're using images, make sure they're good resolution and legible. There's nothing worse than a picture that you can't actually see. And no part of a presentation is supposed to be an eye test, maybe unless you're working at opticians, but generally it should be legible. That's what we're aiming for. And sometimes, I mean, I've used a lot of bullet lists, but at the start I use some kind of I think Smart Art PowerPoint calls it, so like image-based text, to make things more interesting than just maybe a bullet list. Maybe think about that as well. Animation's always a tricky one. I do like a good click and reveal, as you saw earlier when I was doing the stakeholders. What can be really tricky is when things are whizzing in from all over the screen or winking in and out of existence. If you're giving a formal presentation, if I go back to my safety case example, think about what's appropriate. It may not, having kind of all whizzy animation may not be appropriate for a serious kind of formal topic. And please just check it works before you actually give the presentation. The number of times I've seen someone click and everything disappears and they've not expected it, it can really put someone off. So that would be my other tip if you are going to use animation. Now, given a choice, I would always rather give a presentation in person. Yes, it can be really nerve-wracking to have a bunch of people kind of looking at you, but I think the problem with kind of these remote or virtual presentations is you lose all of those non-verbal cues. When you're in person, you can see whether people are following along, nodding off, sneaking out the back, and I also think it's easier for people to dynamically ask questions, in the same way that you as a presenter can read a room easier when, people are physically there. It's the same for your audience. They can sense when a break is coming and interject, and that's easier than perhaps trying to talk on Teams. I mean, we must have all been in meetings where you end up with everyone talking at the same time because there's not that natural kind of cue point for people to step into. And also virtually, it gives you this weird scenario where you feel like you're not actually talking to anyone, especially when you've got presentation mode up and Teams winks everyone out of existence, and it's just you and your presentation. And I think this is where it's really key to be aware of your pacing and not rush along at a rate of knots and leaving your audience behind. So to kind of keep that engagement, because I think that's key, it might be worth asking a specific point. And I'm aware I've ignored my own advice here, so I apologise for that. But it might be worth at specific points asking if people have questions, or maybe have another colleague collating questions in the chat. I think it's definitely trickier to keep people engaged in a remote session because, and I'm sure we've all done it, there's a temptation just to have a quick look at your email or answer some Teams messages or, go on a bit of Google or something. So if it's appropriate, maybe making the session more dynamic might work well. Okay, and then finally, I promise you we're nearly there, is all about, does practice make perfect? And I think absolutely practicing is incredibly important. Whether that's exploring how you put together a presentation, or and how to tell a coherent story, or actually running through what it is that you want to say. Some suggestions if you're inexperienced in giving presentations, or even if you're not. My suggestion would be every time you're in a presentation, make a note of something you like and something you don't, and how you could use that in your own experience to shape your own kind of presenting. So and maybe have a OneNote or similar where you collate these, so when you do get around to doing your own presentation, you've got like your already made set of hints and tips that you can use. Maybe it's worth, if you don't get many opportunities, within the technical arena to present, is to find opportunities to do ones that aren't just work ones. So maybe, your company does some like careers or outreach activities. I mean, I think in some cases presenting to kids is way harder than presenting to adults. That's a really fun one to try. Or maybe you're in a club, a society, a hobby group or something. Are there opportunities there to get up in front of people and to talk? And they ask for feedback from someone, and then add that feedback to your hints and tips list. And, as you go on, you get that continued development. One thing I will say though, and it's a little bit personal preference, I would say you don't want to be over practiced. So I'm all for having notes and knowing what you want to say and time checking and the like. But sometimes you get people who are so practiced or so rigid to a script, it becomes a bit kind of monotone. And again, that pacing disappears and that structure, and it becomes difficult to stay engaged. And I say I'll just finish with, the key to presentations as a system engineering, as I mentioned at the start, is taking someone on a journey and telling them a story. And you need them to be engaged so that you can do that and be successful. Okay, so thank you very much for bearing with me, and hopefully there's been some useful information in there. And we've done a real whistle-stop tour of how to use system engineering concepts to put together presentations, a few things that, from my perspective, are things to be mindful about when putting together presentations. And assuming there's any time left, I thought, maybe open the floor for a bit of a wash up. And, if anyone had any wanted to share or any questions they had, now might be a good time for that. So yeah.
See, Callum's got his hand up.
Hi, thank you very much for that. Really enjoyed it. I really like the idea about putting so much effort into the planning phase. I feel like for me, the idea of doing a plan before throwing slides together is only a recent thing. I've had to do a few recently, and just doing a plan at all was like, oh my goodness, this is so much easier. So taking that a step further, love that idea. My question is kind of around, what does that look like when you're doing it? Obviously, you talked about kind of the framework of doing it, but in terms of how do you do it? Is this all on a bit of paper, lots of spreadsheet, like bits of paper everywhere? Is it a spreadsheet? Do you have a OneNote? What have you found to be the best way of capturing all that information? And do you do it consistently, or does it change presentation to presentation?
Yeah, there's a really good question. So I'm a bit old school. I do like a pen and paper. I like to sort of doodle things out and maybe do a bit of a brainstorm and those things. The reason I don't do it generally in an electronics tool is sometimes I can't keep up with the electronics tool and the thoughts I have, so it's easier to write or doodle stuff down. So I normally do that, and then what I normally like to do is put a straw man together in PowerPoint, and I actually, a lot of the time, the slides are almost the last thing I put together because I want to think about what I want to say. I think about the flow. I kind of, come up with some bullet lists of what I want to talk about, and then I kind of do the slides from those. I find if I try and write slides and then think about what I want to say, it doesn't, or I end up with all of the words in the world on my slides. So I'm kind of very much like, I go, right, this is what I want to say now. How do I make the slides reflect that? But yeah, no, I like a good pen and paper and sort of, think about the flow. That's what I did for this, thought about the flow, broke it down in some sections and built it up from there. But I must admit, I am guilty. It does depend on what I'm doing. And I do actually find I do it more if I'm doing something where I have to think about it more, if that makes sense. If you said, oh, tell me about this particular product, I would probably just go straight to writing on slides, which I've kind of realized is perhaps a bad habit. And actually, maybe sometimes the value or the quality of what I generated would be benefited by actually taking that step back sometimes and doing that upfront work, even if it was just very top level.
Sure.
So.
Sure, thank you. And if I could be permitted a follow-up, I had to do a presentation recently that had a very strict time limit, and I really struggled with. I did a bit of a plan, and I put my slides together, and I ran through a practice and realized I was twice over the limit. Obviously, the kind of the traditional way of thinking is, a rule of thumb would be a minute per slide, but I hadn't. Perhaps if I planned it better, I would have ended up with less slides. But I ended up with probably about the right number of slides, but they were very busy. How would you factor in timing before you get to the point of slide creation?
Yeah, and that's I think it's a bit like with this. I kind of went. I knew I had 3 sections, but I knew this wash up section, unfortunately, was going to be the poor man to the previous 2, because and then the system piece was probably going to be longer than that middle section, and so I had kind of notionally in my brain gone, what is put some relative importance into those different sections. If I do a slide, if I do a slide per minute, I end up with like way too many. I have learned that about myself. I have to do less slides and always assume they're going to take me a few more minutes than anticipated. Because quite often I'll be presenting and I have a thought and I'm, oh, while I'm here, I'll also now talk about this. Or sometimes I'll lose my way slightly and then be like, oh dear, I've wasted precious minutes talking about something that wasn't originally on my plan. So yeah, I think it's a part of it comes from unfortunate experience. You know, how do you, you know, the way that you like to communicate, the way that you like to put your material together. But I think it's kind of doing that. What's the real important pieces and what's the stuff that if I needed to, I could leave in some ancillary slides at the end. So if I had the time, I could do them. If I don't, the material is there for people to look at them separately and so on and so forth. But it is a trick. And I say I have that one slide a minute thing has never worked for me. I've gone, that's great. But if I had done 40 slides for this, we'd be going for another like 2 hours. So, you know.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your questions, Callum. Does anyone else have anything? Zishan, go for it.
Hello, hi. Yeah, thanks. That was wonderful. I think there was quite a bit of information, very useful there. I just wanted to say one of the initial slides was, you know, that was very sort of appropriate, and you know, probably the first time I'm seeing the implementation of systems engineering. The way you presented the systems engineering approach, and then relate to that the planning of your presentation in the very first slide. I think that was one of the very few times I've seen a very non-engineering topic being discussed in a systems engineering way. And I think, yeah, for me, that was like a new thing to take back, not just the planning, but also the essence of what we're trying to do is the systems engineering. You know, taking the systems engineering approach to problem solving. I think that was wonderful. The question I have is related to stakeholders, specifically when you're presenting to senior management. There seems to be, I normally struggle in such presentations because the amount of information that needs to go does not necessarily, you know, to be very technical. And there's also very time, you know, there's time limits. There's the amount of stuff that you can say or, you know, just talk in front of them, because normally a few lines and there's a quick question that comes up, or there's a potential solution that comes up. But how do you sort of normally manage these kind of presentations when you're presenting to senior management?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? Because there's that you get that, like say, that limited window to get across what you need to, and I think as well there's always that perception of wanting to do a good job, right? So you end up with some pressure before you even start. But I think that the key bit is really looking at, okay, what is it I want to tell them? I would tackle it in the same way I tackle any other presentation. I'd be like, what is it I want to tell them? What do they need to know? And how do I do that within the constraints of what I have? You know, what information do they already know? What information do they not have that they need to, I don't know, make the decision or go forward? And you know, is there anything that I need to go and find out about what they know before I give my presentation or my discussion? I think that's one of the key areas, because I think unfortunately it depends. It's not one side. It's not, I wish it was like a cookie cutter thing, because I sell it and make millions maybe, but or maybe not, but you know, it's one of those things. It's really, it's that audience understanding piece, and that's what I would go back to. You know, what are they really looking to get out of it? If you don't know, there is no harm in asking people, because people would always rather you gave something of value than not. So, you know, having conversations with your peers, or maybe some of your like management, I'm saying, actually, you know, is this, have I got the right end of the stick of how I should, you know, what they want to know? Because if you nail that problem statement, then it's a case of just answering that problem statement, right? If you know what it is you're trying to do, which I make sound really easy, like, oh, just, you know, get your problem statement right and it'll be fine. But if you can do that kind of work of understanding your stakeholders, what the, you know, that one line or two liner is that you're trying to achieve, I think you'll find it will help kind of focus a little bit more about what needs to be given. And I say some of that just comes, unfortunately, with practice and experience. But I also find if you can kind of write some of that down, people love it, right? If you go with a blank piece of paper and say to someone, what do you think I should do? People are like, oh, if you go to someone and say, I think I'm doing this, right? People are much more keen to get the red pen out and be like, right, do you know what? I'll help you with this. Does that make sense? So I think kind of if you can come up with something what you think and then find some people to discuss it with and kind of help formalize some of that, that might be a useful way forward. But for me, I always just think, what does that person need to know? What is it they're looking to get out of this? What do I need to answer? Start there and then form it from that. So that was a very waffly answer. I don't know if it helped.
That's useful. Thank you. Yeah.
Great. Well, conscious of time, but it's pretty good timing overall. So well done. You practice what you preach, Vicky. So yeah, just a massive thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. I know that I personally got a lot out of that, which was my evil plan all along. But I hope that everyone else on the call found that interesting. And as mentioned, this recording is going to go up on YouTube, and the slides will also get those sent out for everyone. So yeah, just a massive thank you again, Vicky. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Vicky.
Good stuff.
Nathan.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.